Hello everybody, and welcome to my Lost Caverns of Ixalan draft guide. In this video, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to find success in your Lost Caverns of Ixalan drafts. I will be discussing the new set mechanics, the top commons for each color, I will provide archetype overviews, I'll show you some combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Let's kick things off with the set mechanics. They are Craft, Descend, Discover, and Map tokens. Craft is a new mechanic found on artifacts, and it is an activated ability that involves paying mana as well as exiling some cards. So in the case of Otekland Landmark, the craft ability is to pay 2 into white, and then because it is craft with artifact, you have to exile another artifact you control or an artifact card from your graveyard. And what you get in return is you get to transform it into Otekland Levitator. So there's all sorts of craft costs. They cost varying amounts of mana, and also the things you have to exile in order to craft will sometimes change. So just read each card individually, but it is fairly self-explanatory. Next is Descend, and there are actually 2 variants of Descend, both of which care about having permanent cards in your graveyard. In the case of some cards, like Broodrage Mycoid, they care if you descended during your turn. So Broodrage Mycoid cares if a permanent card was put into your graveyard from anywhere. So that includes the battlefield, directly from your deck, or from your hand if you discarded a permanent, for example. There are also Descend cards that care about having a certain number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So in the case of Didact Echo, it has Descend 4, so it gets an extra upside if you have 4 permanents in your graveyard. Next is Discover, a mechanic that is going to say Discover followed by a number on the card. So in the case of Geological Appraiser, it says Discover 3, but there are plenty of other cards that discover varying numbers. So the way Discover works is you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with mana value X or less, where X is the Discover number, in this case 3, and then you cast it without paying its mana cost, or put it into your hand, and the rest of the cards that you exiled go on the bottom of your library in a random order. So another fairly self-explanatory mechanic. The last new mechanic is Map tokens, and they are fairly self-explanatory as well. There are some cards that make map tokens, so for example, Spyglass Siren comes into play and creates a map token, and then you can use a map token by paying 1, tapping it, and sacrificing it to have target creature you control explore. Exploring means you reveal the top card of your library, and if the card is a land, you put it into your hand. Otherwise, you put a counter onto the creature exploring, and you can put the card that you are looking at into your graveyard, or you can put it back on top of your library. So another fairly straightforward mechanic. Moving on to the top commons, kicking things off with white. At number 1 is Oltek Cloudguard. This is a great flyer that comes with a ground blocker as well, and it can attack in the air while the 1/1 does its best to hold the fort. It's just a really nice card that gives you 2 bodies for 1, and as such is worth taking highly. At number 2 is Petrify, which is just a nice removal spell for white. There is a minor sacrifice theme in this set, especially in black, which means that oftentimes your opponent is going to be able to get a little bit of extra value out of the creature you petrify, but it's still nice being able to answer any problematic threat for just 2 mana. And then at number 3 is Glorifier of Suffering, a card that is really powerful if you can get it to work properly. Basically, it's 3 mana for 5/4 worth of stats if you have a random artifact lying around or a creature that you're hoping to sacrifice anyway, and as such, it's a card that is worth putting into your deck and building around a little bit, because if you can get to the upside of this card, it is absolutely stellar. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Waterwind Scout, a 2/2 flyer for 3 that also comes with a map token, which is absolutely fantastic. Map tokens are really good with cards that care about descending. They're also really good with cards that care about artifacts, and overall, making a 2/2 flyer and also a map is just really good for 3 mana. At number 2 is River Herald Scout, 2 mana for a 1/2 that explores. Very simple, but also very effective. If you hit a land, it's going to help fuel your rest of your game plan, and if you hit a non-land, then it's going to be a 2 mana 2/3, which really holds the fort and lets you deploy your other spells. At number 3 is Brackish Blunder, a card that's really nice if you're a defensive deck or even an aggressive deck, because if you're defensive, you're going to get that extra map token when you bounce your opponent's attacker, and if you're aggressive, sometimes you can kill your opponent before they can redeploy their threats. Next up, we have black, and at number 1 is Join the Dead, a 3 mana instant speed removal spell that kills basically any creature you care about. In the early turns, -5/-5 is good enough to kill almost everything, and by the time your opponent plays some bigger creatures, the -10/-10 ability should be active. At number 2 is Dead Weight, a removal spell that really works well with Descend because once it kills your opponent's creature, Dead Weight then goes to the graveyard, and since it's an enchantment, it does count as a permanent, which is great for a removal spell. At number 3, we have Fanatical Offering, which is a versatile card draw spell that works great with Descend. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice an artifact or creature, which will trigger your cards that care about descending, and then you get to draw 2 and create a map token, which is really nice. Oftentimes, you can even mitigate the downside of sacrificing a creature by sacrificing a creature that your opponent is targeting with a removal spell or something like that. Moving on to red, at number 1 we have Abrade, which is just a stellar removal spell in this set. Dealing 3 damage for 2 mana is already great, and there are also tons of big artifacts running around thanks to Craft, which means Abrade is great on both modes and worth picking highly. At number 2 is Volatile Wanderglyph, which is a really nice 2-drop for red because not only can it attack and get you some card filtering that way, but there are also cards that just care about having you tap your creatures as a cost, and so Volatile Wanderglyph works great with those and helps you continue filtering through your deck and getting rid of lands you don't need, or helping you find lands if you do need them in the early turns. And then at number 3 is Rumbling Rockslide, a 4-mana removal spell that scales well with the game and can take care of problematic threats. Just what red needs to keep the attacks flowing. Finally, we have green. At number 1 is Huatli's Final Strike, a great removal spell that also sometimes doubles as a combat trick and just does everything you want to do with green removal. It also plays well with Poison Dart Frog, which is the number 2 green common, because Poison Dart Frog can gain Death Touch, which does work well with the Huatli's Final Strike damage. But speaking of Poison Dart Frog, 2 mana for a card that can tap to add mana of any color is just great, and even in the late game it has relevance because Death Touch is a great ability, and it even has reach, so Poison Dart Frog is worth taking highly, and fuels perfectly into the number 3 green common, which is Pathfinding Axejaw, a 4-mana 4/3 that enters the battlefield and explores. With the help of the Dart Frog, you can even cast it on turn 3, which is great, but Pathfinding Axejaw is great no matter when you cast it, because even if you hit the land or don't hit the land, it's great either way. For a 4 mana, you get a 4/3 and draw a card if you hit the land, or a 4 mana for a 5/4 that lets you decide what to keep on top of your deck is also great. So Pathfinding Axejaw is an excellent card in any green deck. Moving on to the color rankings, it's worth saying that color rankings are going to be more of a tiebreaker than anything. It's better to find the open colors than it is to force a color that is quote-unquote best or avoid a color that is quote-unquote worst. But if you are looking for a tiebreaker, black is at number 1, white is at number 2, green at number 3, red at number 4, and blue at number 5. Moving on to the archetype overviews, starting with red-white. It is a tapping mid-range deck using cards like Caparocti Sunborn as a versatile mid-range threat that can tap some of your untapped artifacts and creatures to get a bit of extra value. Gold Fury Strider as a top-end card that can tap your artifacts and creatures to buff a key threat. And Guardian of the Great Door, which can be a really undercosted flyer if you have built your deck to have untapped artifacts and creatures running around. So a nice mid-range deck for red instead of being all-out aggro like it often is. Moving on to blue-black, it is a Descend control deck that cares about filling its graveyard and leveraging Descend cards. Uchbenbach, the Great Mistake, is a great 5-drop for this deck because a 6/4 Vigilance Menace is just a must-deal-with threat, and if you filled your graveyard, then Uchbenbach is going to come back, and your opponent's going to have to deal with it again. Council of Echoes is another card that rewards you for filling your graveyard. It's a big flyer that gets you some nice tempo advantage when you play it, if you've done the work of filling your graveyard, and so it's a great top-end card for this deck. And then Chupacabra Echo is a great 2-for-1 removal spell in this type of deck, because if you're filling your graveyard with permanents like you're trying to do to work with your other cards, Chupacabra Echo is a great 4-mana 3/2, kill your opponent's creature, great value. Moving on to green-white, we have an aggro deck that cares about buffing your creatures. Kutzil Malamet Exemplar is the perfect card for this deck because it's the 3-mana 3/3 that lets you draw extra cards when you hit your opponent with creatures that have power greater than their base power. It's also worth noting that an Explore creature that gets a counter from Exploring will trigger this automatically without you needing to do any extra work. Explorer's Cache, however, is a great card in this sort of deck because for 2 mana, you get an artifact that lets you just periodically put +1/+1 counters onto your creatures so they'll have higher power than their base power. And then Malamet Warscribe is a great top-end card for this sort of deck because it lets you buff your creatures and swing in for a big attack with creatures that have power greater than their base power. Moving on to blue-red, this is an artifact aggro deck, so it can use a card like Captain Storm to buff your creatures whenever you play artifacts, Zoetic Glyph to turn your artifacts into big threats, and Diamond Pickaxe to be an early equipment that gives you a steady stream of artifacts to fuel your other synergies. So be on the lookout for artifacts and cards that use your artifacts aggressively in this blue-red deck. Next up, we have black-green, which is a grindy Descend mid-range deck. You get access to a card like Akawali, the Seething Tower, which starts off as a 3-mana 3/3 in the early game, but as you descend deeper and deeper into the caverns and fill your graveyard, it grows into a 5/5 and then even a 7/7 that's hard to block. You also gain access to Stinging Cave Crawler, which is another nice 3-drop that cares about having a full graveyard because you'll be able to get some card advantage when it attacks if you've enabled that Descend 4. And then Kawati Scavenger is similar, where a 3-mana 3/2 on its own isn't the best, but if you can buy back a permanent from your graveyard to your hand when it comes into play, then you're in great shape. So it's definitely worth stocking your graveyard and grinding your opponent out. Next up, we have Blue-White, which is an artifact control deck. You gain access to Master's Guide Mural, which makes a 4/4 for 5 mana, but then as you survive into the later stages of the game, you can craft with an artifact and pay 7 mana to flip it into Master's Manufactory, and then start spitting out a stream of 4/4 tokens to take over the game. Spring-Loaded Saw Blades is similarly great in this control strategy, because for 2 mana you can kill one of your opponent's tapped creatures, namely an attacking creature, and then you can craft it with an artifact to flip it into Blade Wheel Chariot, which is another late-game threat. Lodestone Needle is another card that can help delay your opponent by tapping their creatures down, and then when you craft it with an artifact, you get Guidestone Compass, which, again, in the late game is going to help you outgrind your opponents by giving you a steady stream of card selection, or even just value if you're hitting lands. Moving on to Red-Green, we have a Dinosaur Stompy strategy. You gain access to Itzquinth, Firstborn of Gishath, which is a 2-mana 2/3 haste that if you wait until turn 4, you can pay 2 extra mana and have one of your dinosaurs deal damage to one of your opponent's creatures, so get a nice 2-for-1 out of the bargain. You also gain access to Belligerent Yearling, which is a 2-mana 3/2 trample, already good, that gets even more power if you play big dinosaurs, so another great 2-drop for this strategy. And then Earthshaker Dreadmaw is a perfect top-end card because it's a 6-mana 6/6 trample that also gets you good card advantage if you have a board full of dinosaurs. Next, we have White-Black, which is a deck that cares about sacrifice. Bartolome del Presidio is the perfect card for this deck because he comes down on turn 2 and then gives you a free sacrifice outlet for the rest of the game because he can sacrifice other creatures or artifacts without having to pay mana, and he grows as he does so by putting counters onto himself. Vanguard of the Rose is another great early drop for this deck because a 2-mana 3/1 that can gain indestructible is really hard to deal with in combat. And then Synapse Necromage is also fantastic in this deck because when you sacrifice it, you get 2 more 1/1s, which you can also sacrifice, so it is perfect sacrifice fodder. Moving on to Blue-Green, we have an Explore Midrange strategy. Nikanzel Current Conductor is the perfect 2-drop for this deck, because when you do explore, you can ramp if you hit a land by putting it directly into play, or you can grow the Nikanzel, so it's all upside. Next is Twists and Turns, which is a great 1-drop for this deck, because when you do explore, you'll get to scry 1 first, which gives you extra chances to hit the land or spell that you're looking for on top of your deck. When you get to 7 lands, you get to flip Twists and Turns into Mycoid Maze, which provides you a steady stream of value to win the late game. Merfolk Cave Diver is another nice card for this deck, because as a 3-mana 2/4 that can gain +1/+0 and unblockable when you explore, it really has a lot of potential to end the game. Finally, we have Black-Red, which is a Descend beatdown deck. You gain access to Zoyowa Lava Tongue, which is a 2-mana 2/2 with Death Touch that also punishes your opponent if you are able to descend on your turn. Canonized in Blood lets you grow your creatures when you descend, and in the late game can flip into a 4/3 flyer, and Enterprising Scallywag is really good in this deck because if you're able to trigger its descend ability once, on your following turns you'll have a treasure, and you can always sacrifice that treasure to trigger descend on your end step, get a new treasure, and also trigger all of your other cards that care about descending. So Enterprising Scallywag is a really good enabler in this deck. Next, we'll be discussing the common combat tricks that you should be aware of so you don't get blown out. In white, there is Acrobatic Leap and Family Reunion. In blue, there is Cogwork Wrestler and Relic's Roar. In black, there is Fungal Fortitude. In red, there is Ancestor's Aid. And in green, there is Staggering Size and Malamet Scythe. It's important to be aware of these cards because if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, these are the cards they are most likely to have. Moving on, we have some trap cards you should be avoiding. And first up, we'll talk about Song of Stupefaction. It looks like the sort of card that would be good if you care about filling your graveyard and slowing the game down, but the problem is that in a lot of decks, you still want to be able to attack at some point, so if you shrink your opponent's big creature, they'll still have it available to block with, so a 4/4 that turns into a 0/4 is still a real card on the board, so you haven't really removed it, and that makes Song of Stupefaction a card that's just not really worth playing. Next, Abyssal Gorestalker looks like the sort of card that could just be generically powerful, but the problem is that if you top deck it on an empty board state, it has to sacrifice itself, which means that if you're trying to push your advantage by jamming your 6-drop, you're really going to be hurting your chances. Also, if you're really far behind and you don't have a board state and you just need your 6/6 to be a blocker, you'll have to play this card. They'll sacrifice their 2 bad creatures and you'll lose your 6/6. And so even in the cases where you think this sort of effect would be good, it often doesn't do what you want it to do, which is why Abyssal Gorestalker is a card that I recommend avoiding unless you have a specific deck where you have a lot of fodder lying around. Finally, Contested Game Ball looks like the sort of card that would be good for pushing your advantage in an aggressive deck. But the problem is that paying 2 mana and then 2 more mana just to draw a card isn't worth it in your aggressive decks because you'd rather be adding to the board and continuing to pressure your opponent. Also, if you are in an aggressive deck and you happen to fall behind, your opponent then gets to take the Contested Game Ball and start drawing cards off of the card that you played, which is just really bad and makes Contested Game Ball a card that you should be avoiding. Next, we have some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. Mephitic Draft plus Fanatical Offering is really nice because Mephitic Draft is a 2-drop that draws you a card and then really wants to go to the graveyard so you can get another card out of it. And Fanatical Offering lets you sacrifice it and get extra value. So Mephitic Draft plus Fanatical Offering draws you a bunch of cards and lets you pull ahead in the card advantage battle. Next, we have the combo between Waylaying Pirates and Quicksand Whirlpool. Waylaying Pirates lets you tap your opponent's creature if you have an artifact and put a stun counter on that creature. And Quicksand Whirlpool gets a discount when it targets a tapped creature, which means that with the 2 cards, you can tap your opponent's creature and then exile it with a discounted Quicksand Whirlpool, which is great because if your opponent isn't interested in attacking you, it might be hard to get the discount on the Whirlpool otherwise. Next, we have the combo between Tinker's Tote and Glorifier of Suffering. We already talked about how Glorifier is really good if you can enable it, and Tinker's Tote is perfect because it is a 3-mana artifact that comes with 2 1/1s, and then you can just sacrifice the Tinker's Tote to your Glorifier of Suffering, put counters on both 1/1s or one of the 1/1s and your Glorifier, and you just get to maximize the Glorifier without having a big downside. Finally, we have the combo between Nurturing Bristleback, or really any of the basic land cyclers, and Defossilize. Defossilize is a 5-mana way to bring a creature back from your graveyard to the battlefield and then explore twice. And Nurturing Bristleback is a 7-drop that can easily put itself into the graveyard. So if on turn 2 you cycle your Nurturing Bristleback and get a forest, on turn 5 you can defossilize it, bring it back into play, and have a giant dinosaur ahead of schedule. Moving on to the mana fixing available at common, and right off the bat, it's pretty apparent that there is not a lot. In the land slot, you gain access to Promising Vein, which is a really nice way to fix, but it's only 1 card in the set, and Captivating Cave, which is a little bit worse, especially because it just adds an extra mana to whatever card you are trying to splash, which can be pretty significant, though it is nice that in the late game you can sacrifice it to put 2 counters on a creature. Then, at the artifact slot, you gain access to Compass Gnome, which is another card that isn't really ideal, because 2 mana for a 2/1 just is very low stats, and putting a land on top of your deck means that, sure, you'll get your fixing, but you do have to play the Compass Gnome to do that. You also have some one-shot fixers, or less reliable form of fixing. So, Buried Treasure can come down on turn 2, and then you can use that if you are trying to fix. Poison Dart Frog, as we already highlighted, can tap for mana of any color, but it's hard to rely on it because your opponent will kill it, or you'll have to trade it in combat, or things like that. And then Ancestor's Aid and Plundering Pirate in red can get you treasures, or Greedy Freebooter in black can get you treasures if you get it to your graveyard, because you'll get that treasure token when it dies. Moving on to some final tips. First, have ways to trigger Descend without relying on combat. There are plenty of powerful cards in the set that care about having permanents go to your graveyard, but having to rely on your opponent blocking your attacker or things of that nature is really unreliable, so it's great to have cards like Maps, which you can sacrifice, send to your graveyard, and trigger your Descent cards. It is worth noting that tokens like Maps and Treasures do temporarily go to your graveyard, so they will trigger your Descent cards, even though they instantly disappear after that. It's also worth noting that a land cycler, like Marauding Brinefang, will also trigger your Descent cards because it's a permanent that goes to your graveyard when you island cycle it, or things like that. So keep an eye out for those if you do have cards that care about descending. And then finally, prioritize the cave lands because they are a simple way to prevent mana flood, and there are cave synergies. So a card like Hidden Nursery does come into play tapped, but in the late game when you're top decking, you can spend 5 mana and get another card from your deck, and that's really, really powerful. And if you do take some of the caves, you gain access to cards like Sinuous Benthesor, which is really good because if you have the ability to play 6 mana and then look at the top X cards and put some extra cards into your hand with a Sinuous Benthesor, that's really, really nice. So prioritizing the caves over mediocre playables is really nice because it buffs up your mana base, gives you the ability to win late games where otherwise you would be flooding out, and lets you play cards that care about caves. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy it, remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag #FoundCaverns, because hopefully after watching this draft guide, you'll feel a lot less lost going into your Lost Caverns of Ixalan drafts. That's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.